Hi, everyone, and welcome to another one of my Podbean podcast and YouTube interviews on Gaudium et Spes 22. As you know, Gaudium et Spes 22 is a reference to a Vatican II document, section 22, and I've devoted a great deal of my blog and podcast to discussing ideas and then interviewing theologians that are interested in unpacking, defending, expositing the Second Vatican Council, which I think has a tremendous ongoing significance. To that end, I am very excited with the two guests we have today because they are the co-authors of a new book, Vatican II, A Very Short Introduction. Is it? I have to check my glasses. Yes, it is a very short introduction, is what it's called. And it's part of a series. And what's the press? Holy crap, I'm so unprepared here. Oxford University Press. Yes, I'm pulling up my glasses because the image is up here and I thought I'd be able to read it really well and I can't. But anyway, Oxford University Press, which is really a very highfalutin press. So kudos to you guys. But it is, I've read some of the books in this series, and they're really good. And yours is no exception. I told Stephen off camera that I finally finished reading the last fourth of the book this morning over my morning coffee. And I really encourage all of my viewers and listeners, every one of you, if you're interested in Vatican II, to really rush out and buy this book because you will find, I think, no better in English short introduction to the main themes and history and so forth, players of the council, than this short but jam-packed little book. And it's also written in an extremely accessible style. And so, I just can't gush about it enough. I think it's a really, really great book. And I've read a lot of books on Vatican II, and this is the best of the lot in its genre of a sort of basic introduction to the text. Anyway, my guests are two guys I've actually had on here before. Okay, Stephen Bullivant, who is, I interviewed you about your book, Non-Verts,
Yeah.
I do believe. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so Stephen is a big time sort of expert on why it is that people don't believe this here stuff no more and just sort of walk away from the church. What is the cause of, because we all just sort of assume that we know what causes disbelief or unbelief. And it's actually more complex than we think. And then also we have Shaun Blanchard. I've had you on before. Was it once or twice, Shaun?
Just once.
Yeah. Just was Hauser with us?
No, just you and me.
It was just you and me.
Although I listened to your interview with Stephen while I was jogging one day, and I felt like I was, talking to two friends, I felt like I was sort of in the car. I kept interjecting, but no one paid heed of me.
All right. Well, that's the goal. That's the goal. And just so people know, we got our times mixed up, and we're starting this interview an hour earlier than I expected. So I did not have time to sort of jot down everybody's official titles, which I was going to do in about half an hour. So if you two could do that for me right now, let's start with Shaun. What is your official title and position?
I'm currently a senior research fellow at the National Institute for Newman Studies, which is based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but I live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana with my wife, Anne Marie. It's unseasonably cold today. It's like 65 Fahrenheit. So
I hate you. I hate you.
It's freaking out.
And please plug please plug your last book, which is what you and I were talking about.
Right. Yeah, we were talking, Larry and I, the first time we spoke, we're talking about my monograph, The Synod of Pistoia and Vatican II, which Stephen read in a COVID fever.
It was like, I was like, honestly, this was like proper early old school COVID, like, paramedics coming COVID before vaccines.
Oh, the Delta, you had the Delta variant then.
I decided that, this was like alpha. I mean, this was early. This was like a few weeks in. And I decided that, if I was going to go out, I was going to go out on a high. So I was going to read Shaun Blanchard's book.
So he was making,
because you can never know.
Better to burn out than to fade away,
Because as you potentially approach your great creator maker, you can't possibly know enough about the Council of Pistoia,
right? Yeah.
to get ready for that. But it is a great book, which is why I had you on. All right,
Yeah,
and then Stephen, your official title.
I am Professor of Theology and the Sociology of Religion at St Mary's University in London, and also a Professorial Research Fellow in Theology and Sociology at the University of Notre Dame in Sydney, Australia. The proper
Ooh,
Notre Dame.
that's right.
I,
Stephen,
I,
Shaun, you wanted to add something?
yeah, I was going to add that Stephen, in his COVID fever, was making memes about Scipione Dorici based on
Oh.
movies like Mean Girls. So I was loving his
That's great.
but
Right.
I'm also taking up a position at the same university as Stephen, so University of Notre Dame. But I'll be at the Fremantle campus in Western Australia. So as of July, that will be.
Yes, I saw that. I read that
We will be
somewhere.
colleagues, Stephen.
Yeah.
I now have
That'd be
so many
great.
friends. I
So
now have so
exciting.
many friends in Australia. I guess I need to go down under whatever and see people. Philippa
Tracy,
Martyr, Tom Gourlay,
Yeah.
and
yeah,
so
right.
Tracy
Yeah,
Rowland's at Notre Dame as well.
Tracy Rowland. Yeah, I have a lot of friends down there. So now I need to head down there, and yet another friend will be down there.
yeah.
But anyway, let's
Right.
my apologies for being underprepared here. Usually I have like credentials written down, titles, names of books, and so forth. And I was just doing all of that when I got the message that
Oh, don't.
Stephen was signing into Zoom, and I thought, oh no. But anyway, here we go. We're going to be talking about a lot today about Vatican II. So I don't necessarily want to address one of you in particular. So whichever one of you wants to respond to sort of my first question here, just feel free to jump in. You can sort of agree amongst yourselves as to who's going to go first. The first thing that I want to ask you guys is, why was the council called in the first place? It's often said that the council addressed no crisis, unlike every other council in the history of the church, which was called to address a crisis of some kind. There was no crisis, apparently, that the council was addressing. So why was it called? And that's what ended up causing it to be such a vague and nebulous failure, so we're told, right?
Yeah.
So why was the council actually called? What's the real answer to that question?
Because there was a crisis.
Yes.
Basically, you don't bother calling a council if there isn't one. It's a different kind of crisis, and it is almost that there's a kind of a various things in various areas, and Shaun might talk about some of the stuff he writes in the chapters about sort of modernism and the erection to modernism, kind of unfinished business and things around modernity and things, but some of the stuff that I'm very interested in is there's this real sense of a pastoral crisis in northern, western, southern Europe. So all those great council fathers and bishops and the popes who were so critical. People like Rana, people like de Lubac, people like Congar, people like Ratzinger, people like Kung, people like Danielou, people like Roncalli, people like Montini. In the 30s, 40s, 50s, we can cite passages after passage after passage where these are seriously concerned that we're losing the young people, we're losing the working classes. Rana in the mid-50s is talking about, the Christian, it lives in a diaspora situation in the heart of his own families.
1958, his article in Hochschild, the new heathenism in the church. And it will also include literary figures like Bernanos, who already in 1936, right, opening page of Diary of a Country Priest, the priest says, my parish is bored stiff, like all the rest of them. And there's not a damn thing we can do about it in so many words.
In the 30s and 40s, the French church has been described as mission territory. This is where Roncalli is the nuncio.
The example I always give is that two French priests write a book in 1943. La France, Pays de Mission, is France missionary territory, which is a kind of unthinkable when you look at the 19th century revival of Catholicism, especially in France, and the amount of missionaries that they're sending out to every corner of the world. It's sort of unthinkable that you would have to ask in the 40s, which were the glory years, according to American good religious Americans. The 40s, 50s are the glory years of church attendance. But in parts of Spain, in parts of France, it's catastrophically low practice of the faith.
Well, except that, I mean, you look back at what was considered low practice then,
Yes,
and
right, sure,
so
yeah,
so,
of course,
but
yeah.
no, absolutely. I mean,
All
there's a
relative.
real sense that, I mean, and this is straight after, straight after the devastation of the Second World War, after, just the literal ruins of, if you like, civilization. Um, there's this real sense of pastoral, um, intellectual, moral crisis, and that's certainly part of the kind of the impetus for a council. And there's other things too, but yeah, it's not that it's not like with Nicaea you say, well, there's this kind of Arian crisis, and then you get a council to address that. It's a much more kind of wide-ranging, multifaceted sense that we need to reform things, or we see the way things are heading. And actually, it may be that the way things were heading, actually, you know, uh, there's a debate about how well it managed to address all the kind of laundry list of things it was hoping to address. But that's
Yeah.
ecumenical councils for you. I mean, they very rarely set out and achieve all that they hope to do. But we might
Yeah.
talk about that later, But yeah, no, I mean,
You can actually go all the way back to the 1830s and find sermons from John Henry Newman that were already saying modernity is characterized by deep disbelief. Modernity represents a complete sea change in the mentality of modern people, that it is a completely different consciousness. Now, this is in the 1830s already. You see a high churchman writing about how there is an altogether there's a de-Christianization that is in effect, even if it hasn't shown up in the outward metrics of church attendance. There is, in fact, a de-Christianization going on.
I've been struck recently by that there are many differences between Vatican I and Vatican II in all sorts of ways, but there are some continuities, and I do think one of the continuities is that the reason for calling both councils, is sort of amorphous. It's a sort of a set of isms that are seen as problems by, first and foremost, the Pope, and then advisors, theologians, various people around the Catholic world. It's very clear why Trent is called. It's very clear why Constance is called. But Vatican I is sort of what are the problems? Deism, socialism, nationalism. These are all sort of amorphous problems. It's not called in order.
Rationalism.
A rationalism, at least explicitly. It's not saying, oh, well, we have this church splitting disagreement over the Immaculate Conception or papal infallibility. That's not why it's called. It's called because of this general sense that the church is in a problematic position. And I don't think that's that dissimilar from Vatican II. And that's not really pointed out very often by the people making the kinds of claims that you led this question with, Larry.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, one that I've never actually thought deeply about. But I think now that you mention it, I think that's absolutely true. It also there's something strange about Vatican I and Vatican II as well, it seems to me. And you guys can, and then we'll move on back to the original question. But it seems to me that there is an extremely close collaboration between the Pope and the Council Fathers. I mean, you guys point out in the book, and I think it's true, historically, there's always a bit of a tension between popes and the councils that get called. It really kind of turf wars over who's got more, it goes back to the days of conciliarism and popes not quite trusting councils and so on. So it does seem as if there is in Vatican I and II this coming together of papal authority and conciliar authority in a sort of united front against this perceived problem. Am I wrong about that?
Shaun? I mean, Shaun's the real.
Yeah.
Shaun goes back further than I do. Put it that way. So,
I think that the situation fundamentally changes when you have this kind of ironic or maybe paradoxical situation where a council destroys conciliarism, which is what happens at Vatican I. You have this sort of irony. It's almost like a pope renouncing Ultramontanism, which, I mean, you sort of get in a certain way with John the 23rd. You know, he says, well, I'm only infallible under these circumstances. I'm never going to do that. You know, so it's a sort of like demilitarization of a certain ecclesial space. So I think you get that with a council at Vatican I, where the papacy sees the potential, the ecumenical council becomes a tool of the papacy in a way that Trent, while it was going, later on it becomes a Roman, I don't want to say weapon because that sounds, you know, aggressive, but it becomes a sort of tool in the toolbox for Roman centralization. Whereas I don't think it was that when it was going on.
Right,
The situation profoundly changes with Vatican I. Pius XII, in fact, was considering calling an ecumenical council. There were people close to him. He was very seriously entertaining this idea. And I think that the reason we now have this, again, sort of paradoxical situation of a kind of liberal Ultramontanism under Pope Francis, which is what Bill Potier calls it, where you have a sort of Roman-led synodality, you know, a sort of Roman-led decentralization is sort of unthinkable apart from what Vatican I did, in my opinion.
No, that's a great point.
With all sorts of layers of like paradoxes, and I think in 500 years people will look back on this as kind of its own epoch, very separate.
Well, I'm glad you gave a shout out to my dear friend Bill Portier. I love Bill. He's a great guy.
He mentioned you the last time I saw him very fondly.
Well, yeah, he and I go way back. I've known Bill for a long time. He's a bright guy. But also, I mean, in defense of the seeming incongruity of the use of papal authority to push synodality, could it not also be said, and we'll get back to Vatican II here in a second, could it not also be said that in a church with a hyper-centralized governing apparatus, centralized in Rome, that in order for it to become decentralized, you almost have to have that central authority divest itself? So in other words, it almost has to be a papally driven action to undercut papal centralism from above. That would be, you know.
There's no other institutional mechanism that has any juridical power to do that.
Right. Now, I'm suspicious of synodality. I'm not a big fan of it, but that's a whole different topic for a different show. I want to get back, though, to the issue of the crisis that Vatican II was addressing. And in some ways, this discussion about the coming together of papal and conciliar authority is related to that, because there was a specific, maybe, theological crisis that arose in the late 19th century, early 20th century, to which the council might be responding, so to speak, that goes by this loose, vague designation, modernism. I mean, and Pius X issued the Syllabus of Errors against it. Then, of course, they issued the oath against modernism that everybody had to take, you know, ich werde bei Gott und, you know, the church's doctrines. And so I hate to make that sort of Nazi sort of allusion, but there was a kind of sort of goose step information quality to these various oaths that you had to take. Even if you did not sort of subscribe to them, you better darn well take the oath. So in other words, my point was there was a very sort of authoritarian top-down sort of attempt to suppress modernism as a theological. So my question first off to you guys would be, because you raised the issue in your book, and I agree, was there really a thing, a real thing that we can identify as, oh, that's modernism? Or is it just a sort of vague term used to designate a group of theologies that the papacy was simply uncomfortable with?
I think we disagree on this, don't we?
Stephen's an expert. He's a big Mary Del Val fan. That's his favorite. Stephen's favorite English Catholic of all time. Cardinal
Raphael Mary Del Val. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, you go first.
Well, so I mean, you often, I mean, and my perspective on this is based on I did a particular piece of research once, particularly looking at Newman and Newman's. So Newman gets dragged, you know, Newman's dead by this point, but when Pascendi is published by Pius X, George Tyrrell, who was one of the leading modernists in England, he first of all he thinks that Pascendi is a fair, like you often hear it said that, you know, Pascendi is this complete straw man argument. And you know, it creates this kind of spectacled modernism that doesn't match anything that any of the actual so-called modernists believe or think. Tyrrell reads Pascendi and says it's a fair cop. Like he says, yeah. I mean, he even says it could even have been written by a kind of a fifth column in the Vatican sympathetic to our views. So sort of winsomely does it present everything that we say, right?
Wow.
So Tyrrell certainly thinks, you know, like we'd say now, he feels seen by Pascendi, right? Like, but then very quickly, like then and it becomes this whole kind of thing in like literally in the letters pages of the Times of you know, he then says, well, the Pope's just condemned Cardinal Newman, our beloved Cardinal Newman, and proved that you can't be a good Englishman and a good Catholic because they've just slammed him and everything he stood for. And of course, everyone in the, you know, read him, dear sir, I'm horrified at this popish besmirching of a fine Englishman. And then so that's why I was interested into it because you know, Tyrrell says, look, they've just condemned Newman, and actually one of the main guys at the Vatican, who was the Secretary of State, Cardinal Merry del Val, who is the arch anti-modernist, and he's the son of a Spanish diplomat, born in London, you know, went to college, went to seminary in England, and, you know, dreamt in English and considered himself English despite his name. He loves Newman. So he was very anxious to then kind of put it out that, no, absolutely Newman is not being condemned here. So there's this kind of play that everyone cites Newman in the same way that everyone now cites Newman, or liberals and progressives, everyone loves Newman and brings in their Newman to the fight. So certainly, and I'm certainly no expert on the wider modernisms, but in terms of certainly Tyrrell is quite clear that whatever it is that Pius X is calling modernism in Pascendi not only is a real thing, but that's obvious, that's true.
All right, before we get into the particulars of what it is that allegedly modernist theologians actually held, and therefore how they might have, in some sense, led to Vatican II, Shaun, do you have a response to what Stephen said?
Not a good one.
What's that?
Not a good one.
Not a good one. Well, I mean, you know, the examples are always Tyrrell and Loisy, right? So, right. I mean, yeah, were there individuals who held imminent pantheism or whatever I can't remember the exact phrases of Pascendi. Sure, there were, but was there a massive conspiracy in every single diocese, you know, to undermine the Catholic faith? Well, no, I don't think there was at all. So, I mean, even Merry del Val, he thought that Umberto Benini, so, you know, close to the imminence gris of the liturgy in surname, but he thought that there were people in the Vatican who were going way too far. They were either paranoid or they were settling scores. So I think I mean, it's very similar to the debate over Jansenism. I mean, you can look at Unigenitus and say, okay, well, who holds this and in what way do they hold it? Well, Canel does, the guy they're targeting, but do other people hold it in precisely this way? Or is this really just diverse reform currents, some of which are good and some of which are bad? And I think that's really what we have with modernism too.
Yeah,
the problem,
that's absolutely fair.
Like, it's just like when you look at the syllabus of errors, you look at 80 condemnations. I mean, some of them are obviously contrary to the Catholic faith. It's the same thing with Pascendi. So, but the problem is when all this gets rolled up into a hammer and it can bang someone on the head who, you know, points out that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch or something. So I think this is what the Nouvelle Théologie and later the kind of broader racehorsement movement are reacting against, which is modernism becomes a kind of stick that you can beat people with who don't conform to a very, very narrow statement of the case. And I actually know Stephen would agree with that. I think he just
I absolutely
loves
agree.
bashing Tyrrell, which is probably fair enough. I mean, there were people who went too far, and Tyrrell and Loasi, for different reasons, are two of those people.
I mean, anti-modernism becomes the McCarthyism of the Catholic Church, you know, before McCarthyism was a thing.
Yeah.
And really, it does. And so there is, I mean, there is a stifling, and there is, you know, this kind of, well, I mean, there's this kind of thing where, you know, people who go on to become the sort of the great golden generation of the council are deeply suspected, if not silenced. You know, and then, you know,
this is why
10 years later,
this question is, go
John
ahead.
the 23rd himself, he gets access to his Holy Office file when he becomes Pope, and it says suspected Modernism. So it's like,
oh wow, I did not know that. That's news to me. Pope John got access to his own holy. What did it say?
That was the only time he could get it, was because he was Pope, and someone had written in the margin suspected of modernism.
Well, for every tradition, every rad trad out there listening to this, they would say, well, of course he was a modern.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Now that is a commonly relayed anecdote. So
I see. Yeah, a piece
just
of
like with Congar, he allegedly
says
a reform of the church is such a thing possible. I've seen that cited, and I can't get the kind of citation of that, so we take it with a grain of salt.
It's like in my field, you know, Dorothy Day, there's that quote ascribed to her, you know, that we need to bring down this entire filthy, rotten system. And yet you try to hunt that quote down and it's impossible to find. Now, she probably said variations of that in different venues here, and because she was clearly opposed to the filthy, rotten system in which we live. But whether or not she actually said that at a specific moment in exactly that way, who knows? So
yeah, it's like those Chesterton quotes. They're never quite as pithily expressed when you actually trace them to the source. They're about kind of 4 paragraphs, and it's been distilled.
Is distilled down. But anyway, the modernist thing really interests me precisely because I do count myself, obviously, as a racehorsement theologian, nouvelle theologie, communio theologian, whatever you want to call it. And so guys like Blondel, you know, and Danielou and de Lubac were accused of being modernists. And in point of fact, that strikes me as odd. Because in some ways, I think those guys were also in their own way reacting against modernism as it was perceived to be. Now, I know Ratzinger, for example. I don't know if it was when he was just Ratzinger was later as Pope, said that he made some comment about how so many of the problems that were afflicting the post-conciliar church were being caused by the fact that it was a kind of recrudescence of an old-fashioned modernism, which the church tried to deal with in an authoritarian way under Pius X, but which really just suppressed things. And then, of course, it came bubbling back up because it was never adequately dealt with. But then Ratzinger goes on to say, but maybe given the times, that was the only response of the church possible. So this is what I want to sort of toss out there, which is one, I want to talk about some of the specifics of the so-called modernist heresy. And it seems to me that one of the more contentious ones, and you alluded to it, Shaun, wasn't just the role of subjectivity, the role of culture and comparative religions, and the role of historicity and the mediation of revelation. Those are all major themes that even the racehorsement guys eventually take up. I think one of the central things was the importation of 19th century German biblical higher criticism of the Bible. And that the church, the Catholic Church at that time, had no intellectual resources for answering those critiques. And that is perhaps one of the reasons why the answer initially from the church was simply to shut it down. You know, and it waited another 40 years or whatever until we get Divino Flante Spiritu, Providentism, you know, these things from Pius XII that give the sort of open the door a crack to scholarship. Do you think that's a sort of maybe accurate way of seeing as to why the most neuralgic point that the church had with modernism was the approach to biblical, or was it something else?
I don't know that it was necessarily the most neuralgic, because I think it depended on the anti-modernist and so I think there were many Thomists, neo-scholastic Catholics, that were primarily concerned with the philosophical, what they would have termed
Okay.
philosophical modernism. But undergirding there was an anxiety about what modern modes of thought in general could do to the Catholic faith. And contemporary biblical criticism, or 19th century biblical criticism, was seen as a profoundly destabilizing current. And I agree, they didn't have the tools to combat it to an extent, but we just, at the Newman Institute, we just hosted Trent Poplin from Notre Dame,
Oh yeah, I know Trent. Yeah.
who knows the kind of Italian and Roman, specifically the kind of intellectual situation, very, very well. And he's saying, there's never really there are times of there's ebbs and flows, but there's never really a time where Italians and Romans in particular aren't doing like excellent archaeological work or excellent historical work. I mean, they didn't need Germans to teach them how to do historical study. I mean, I've studied some 18th century, Ludovico Muratori, people like this who did at least proto historical critical study. I think it was the biblical component, when combined with the philosophical, and eventually this just gets mushroomed into, like, there's the first encyclical of Pius XI, Ubi Arcano, I believe it's called. I cite it in a short essay on anti-modernism at Vatican II. This encyclical, Pius XI, talks about modernism as, he says, not just theological modernism. I'm sorry, I was trying to pull up the quote, but he says something like, not just theological modernism, but social and political modernism too. So modernism just becomes like everything modern that could threaten or undercut the church. A key element of that is the biblical picture, but to the extent that that's at the forefront, it probably depends upon the anti-modernist in question, and also probably where do the Catholics live, right? Like, Portuguese Catholics are probably not encountering 19th century German historical criticism. They're probably encountering destabilizing conversations about church and state or something like that.
Yeah.
If you live in Cologne or Vienna, then yeah, probably the biblical criticism is central.
Stephen, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Okay.
No.
No. Okay. Well, then it seems to me that, one of the things that, one of the consequences of a lot of the German liberal Protestant biblical exegesis, higher criticism that was going on, was that theological conclusions were being made within the Protestant world that were saying that, therefore, the Bible itself, we can still call it the Word of God, but in a deeply attenuated sense, meaning simply it is a book that is the product of the religious imagination of right, ancient Jews. So it's sort of a mythopoesis, even if it's rooted somewhat in historical events that came from, in other words, essentially it's a human generated document. And God, you might be able to find some Ariadne's thread of God somehow speaking to us and all of that. But in the same way, you could do the same thing with Hindu texts, Buddhist texts, and so on. So there seemed to be a relativizing of religious experience, which the Catholic theological response was to say, this undermines, therefore, the objectivity of doctrine, the truth of the objectivity of doctrine. And that, to me, beyond biblical criticism, the undermining of objective truth in that doctrines enshrine not just religious sentiment and religious affectations in symbolic form, but really are propositional truth statements. Do you think that is an accurate assessment of one of the fears of what modernism was up to?
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's exactly what they were afraid of. I found the Pius XI quote. So this comes back at Vatican II, of the way that modernism is understood by the minority at Vatican II. The more traditionalist, neo-scholastic mind.
Right. Okay.
So the definition gets expanded, and you see this happening with a lot of sort of isms in church history. The definition of Jansenism comes to be about things widely, more expansive than divine grace or penance or whatever. So Pius XI condemns, quote, moral, legal, and social modernism no less decidedly than we condemn theological modernism. So for in the debate over Dignitatis Humanae and the debate over Spes, you have a lot of minority council fathers who are saying, okay, we lost on Dei Verbum, at least in the general map of Dei Verbum, we lost. It's too subjectivist. It's not, Thomistic or neoscholastic enough. But let's not lose on these other matters, relationship of church and state, or the church's engagement with the modern world. So the fear of the minority is this broader definition of modernism, which they would have grown up with in seminary from the prelates that they looked up to and that formed them, is that this is now sort of seeping into the kind of general ethos of Vatican II. And that debate has circled around, and I think we're still, the three of us know this very well, we're still dealing with that debate. Is the general ethos of modern Catholicism too cozy with the modern world, too cozy with culture, with modern political, what have you? So this is really a debate that, as you say, Larry, it goes back to the late 19th, early 20th century, and it's to some extent unresolved. As much as the papacy wants it to be resolved and wants to simply say it is resolved and we're moving on.
Well, and I'm putting the cart before the horse here, but I don't want this whole discussion to be just on modernism. I want to sort of, it began as a discussion of modernism to set up Vatican II, and so we're kind of here. And I want to get back to racehorsement theology eventually, but you bring up Dignitatis Humanae, and I think it's sort of a case in point. The traditionalists wanted to maintain the old thesis hypothesis sort of system. It says, if Catholicism is in a minority, then the church can accept some sort of modicum of religious freedom and accommodation. But if the church is in the majority, then it should push for a kind of integralist confessional sort of ensconcing of Catholicism as the privileged religion and whatever legal ramifications that might have. Dignitatis Humanae comes along and says, we're not touching any of that. Right? The church's traditional teaching and all of that remains intact. All right. And then it goes on to say, but no, it isn't. Because, we have to, even if essentially what Dignitatis, it seems to me, is saying is, even if we're going to have a confessional state, it has to be a confessional state that grants to everyone broad religious freedom rights, one way or the other, rooted in human dignity. And so this raises the issue. So you're right. It's an unresolved and festering question. It's one of those so-called ambiguities of Vatican II that the critics are always sort of pointing to. But it does then bring me then to a question I want to address both of you, because, you lay out in the book basically these kinds of paradigms for interpreting the council. One is the sort of traditionalist rejection of the council, period. It was too ambiguous. And after all, it made no new dogmatic statements, so we're free to reject it. The second is the sort of failed council model that says, well, the council didn't go far enough, it wasn't radical enough, or it just was naive, in many ways. And so we can just sort of dismiss it as a failure, just like the Council of Florence or whatever. Then comes the model of spirit event, which I have recently written about in National Catholic Register. This is the famous spirit of Vatican II, where the council is a kind of spirit-filled event that established a set of processes, a set of reforming sort of movements. The documents are important, but the actual event transcends the document. The significance of the dynamic established for reform transcends the documents itself, which then later justified sort of going beyond the documents. And then
Woodstock, like the idea of Woodstock is much bigger than who was actually there and what actually happened.
Apparently 800 million people that were at Woodstock.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So and I'm writes the song about Woodstock and wasn't there. It's that kind of thing.
Larry, you know more about that. Stephen and I were born in the 80s, so
I was 10 years old and in the state of Nebraska when Woodstock took place, and I was a dyed-in-the-wool right-wing reactionary nut job from hell. So there was I was dead set against all that hippie crap and all that stuff. So
from Muskogee.
It did not appeal to me. I was a little intellectual nerd interested in astronomy and evolution and science and stuff like that. I didn't give a rat's fig for any of that stuff. But anyway, the fourth model is text continuity, sort of where we should pay attention to actually what the texts say, especially and to read them, as Pope Benedict said, in light of the entirety of the tradition and attempting some kind of continuity. So those are the four models. Now, we've kind of sort of established that, and I'm talking too much, I know, but we've established that the council was addressing a crisis, sort of the crisis of modern unbelief, de-Christianization, secularization, the rot that was in the church that people could feel, and to a certain extent, the theological earthquake being caused by various intellectual currents that Catholic theologians had taken up. Now, in the light of those sort of four models there, what emerged really at Vatican II? In this context, we need to maybe discuss then racehorsement theology and its relationship to the modernists, and why many, including myself, and I think you guys would say that the racehorsement theologians sort of won the day at the council. So what does that mean with regard to these four models? I'll just toss that out there to you guys. Stephen, you want to go first on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that first of all, when we talk about these sort of four paradigms, it's really about where the authority lies. Okay, so of course, the council was an event. Of course, it was huge, and I'm, half the time. Well, actually, I'm a theologian and a sociologist, and a lot of the way, which conditions both of the things that I do. Either one, and obviously, the way in which the council is perceived affects how it gets interpreted. Okay? But theologically, kind of dogmatically, these kind of paradigms are really about the authority of the council and where we looked. If we do look to the council as having authority, and of course those first two you mention are kind of anti-accounts in that sense, as the council doesn't have authority, and the other two is like, well, this is where we look within the council to where the authority lies, and obviously the methodology of the council is something that we need to kind of really flag, and something that's very innovative. The council documents are really long for a start, and there's that whole thing that we talk about in the book, but John O'Malley, who gets quoted, probably quoted the most in the book of anyone that isn't a document.
Well, he had a great book on the topic. So
yeah. There's this new genre of teaching that Vatican II does, in the same way that like encyclicals start getting much longer as well. Like you look at, you always hear like Leo the 13th wrote 13 encyclicals on the Rosary, and it's like, yeah, well, some of them are like, a paragraph called an encyclical, and he's like writing to the American bishops to say, hey guys, remember to pray your rosaries.
And Veritate Splendor goes on to like book length.
Yeah, exactly. So we there's a kind of a whole change in genre, a change of the way in which councils do theology and argue for their kind of positions. We've gone from a very kind of canon law, if you like, propositions and responses, and things you're not allowed to say, things like that. And at least part of that is coming out of this, very much more scripturally enriched way of the council speaking. And obviously a lot of it also coming out of this kind of racehorsement of like, well, let's go back to the sources, let's go back to the church fathers. And of course, anyone, the difficulty with going back to the fathers is that anyone can do it, like, and the fathers are polyphonic. So it's a very different way of doing things than, going back to the canons of Trent or something, to kind of, this kind of almost algebraic way of doing theology, if that kind of makes sense. So that becomes important, I think. And also there's just a whole new, which you get in Newman, we talk about Newman a lot here. this is precisely what Newman does as well. You know, he goes back to the fathers.
Yeah. And the thing is this, and we'll get to Shaun. I saw you taking notes, and I know you want to say something, but while this is still fresh in my mind, it's one of the notes I jotted down pre-show, which is it has always seemed to me that one of the reasons why this genre that Vatican II represents is documents engaged in long theological discourse is because in reaction to or in response to modern unbelief, I think one of the things that the Council Fathers had in mind, along with Pope John and then Pope Paul, was that what was needed was the reinterrogation of everything. Right? I think there's a sense in which the council was about everything, you see? and that we need to rethink church doctrine, not in a revolutionary way, but in a radical way, going back to the roots and to sort of let's rethink it from the ground up, which requires all of these longer documents that build off a Thomistic foundation, but then add in more scripture and church fathers and flesh it out a lot more. So that's always sort of been my. So I do like what you had to say there about the longer genre, and I think that's why personally.
No, I think that's right. I mean, the council, you know, has to, when it talks about the nature of the church, it wants to tell you why this is the nature of the church, right? So it has to go back to the scriptures, has to go, you know, and it kind of tells us the story, you know.
Yeah. So Shaun, go ahead.
I was going to say that I think first and foremost, it is the racehorsement style. So that is a kind of discontinuity with the immediate past, but hopefully in a deeper continuity, as Ratzinger would put it, with the scripture and the fathers. But there is continuity with the recent past, as you both alluded to, because you have this sort of explosion of the encyclical and what the encyclical is supposed to do, what kinds of questions is the Pope supposed to be commenting about. So if there are two loci of supreme authority in the church, the Pope and then the bishops as a college headed by the Pope, then I think the logic is, well, if the Pope's talking about economics and warfare and gender and marriage, then we should be as well, because that's what good Catholic teachers do. I mean, and you have the Leo encyclicals, and then the immediate predecessor is Pius XII, and there's this anecdote about people walking into his rooms late at night, the housekeepers, to tell him to go to bed, and he's got all these books laying all over the place, and they go, "Holy Father, what are you doing late at night studying?" And he says, "Oh, well, I'm giving a speech to the Beekeepers Association soon." It's just this kind of ludicrous.
That's a really good speech as well, though. I don't know if you ever read that. It's a really good speech.
I've actually seen that exact speech. I don't know if the one pulled up as but and he gives this address to the Italian midwives. He gives addresses to lawyers, and then John Courtney Murray quotes that about developing thought about religious liberty. So there's this sort of global Catholic intellectual culture that needs to base its desires for development or for theological innovation on authority, whether it's papal or whether it's conciliar. And I think there's a kind of supply and demand thing going on, which is threatening to reach absurdity when you have Francis's Fratelli, or not Fratelli Tutti, what was the one on the environment,
Laudato Si.
I mean, Laudato Si. A lot of these are just enormous. I mean, they're novella length, and so we are. There's pros and cons to all these styles, but Vatican II should be seen, I think, as part of this wider phenomenon of how Catholic teaching works in modernity. And this is just pushing back against, how we started the conversation. There's always this sense of, well, Vatican II is unprecedented. No, nothing else works this way. This is never the way it's been. That's really, it's really part of like I say in my book on Pistoia, it's a point in an arc of reform, stretching back with the issues I was discussing in that book, stretching back to the 18th century. But as far as how the papacy works, how public Catholic teaching works, I think it's a starting in the late 19th century story, as you as you
Yeah,
began.
I think that's a brilliant insight, because I think it's true. We have to take into account also changes in technology, where and levels of education. Where now you've got millions and millions and millions of Catholics all over the world who are now educated and literate and want access to documents and things to read, and so the church is obliged. But also, I think something that often does not get mentioned is at play here. It coincides as well with the demise of the papal states and with the rise of the papacy as a purely spiritual and theological authority, no longer in any way, shape, or form a political authority, except by sort of the moral authority that the church exerts in political matters. And so as the papacy takes on this role more and more and more as simply a teacher in chief of the whole world, all right, it starts producing, more and more of these. That's my little pet theory anyway.
No, it's interesting. You look at someone like the Dalai Lama, who, has no political authority in Tibet anymore. And I don't think anyone looked to him as a world leader when he did. But without that, then becomes another kind of world spiritual leader kind of thing. And it's that kind of role that it frees the papacy to rise above petty politics and to kind of fly to the UN, which of course Paul VI famously does, and shout at them and then fly back like in the same day or whatever he does. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the papacy is no longer the grand potentate of a series of geographic states. It's the papacy is now the Oracle of Delphi in Rome, and so and you get these inflated documents. But anyway, that do you guys have any more that you want to say about that issue, about because that the issue to me is near and dear to my heart, about the relationship between racehorsement and modernism, because as you well know, there's this resurgence of a kind of tradism in the church today, a very simplistic rejection of the council. It's your first paradigm here. Sort of the council represents a rupture with the past, and therefore, because it didn't introduce any new dogmas, we're just free to reject it. And also, as a consequence of that, we are free to reject the so-called new theology, nouvelle theologie, because they're all just modernists. I've seen this over and over again. The racehorsement guys are just modernists by a different name. I'm not certain that people that level that accusation ever really know what modernism was historically. But giving them the benefit of the doubt that maybe they do, I don't know. But maybe you guys could comment about that. For example, in your opinion, was Blondel a crypto modernist? Was someone like a Chenu, especially, or even a Congar, were they sort of so enmeshed in this idea of revelation being mediated through historical structure and subjectivity? Were they crypto modernists? Obviously, I don't think so, but I'd like your thoughts on that.
No, I think the difficulty is, and the trouble with the modernists is that a lot of what they said was right, and this happens all the time in church history, of course. And there's a whole literature around how, the heresies raise good points. Like the classic church heresies, in the early church, raise important points that need solving, and have a partial solution, and then the wisdom of the magisterium kind of brings together the good bits and synthesizes it into a whole. And the classic thing is at Chalcedon, there's two groups, neither of which have got the whole story, and then you put them together in Leo's tome and you get kind of Chalcedonian Christology. And there's a sense in which that's true with modernism, and the sense in which that's true with Trent and Protestantism and things like this, in the sense that obviously what the modernists are reacting to, and at least some of what they are proposing on the back of these very big changes in the world and in society, and in kind of the foundation, especially the kind of scriptural studies, as it turns, much of what they say, Vatican II ends up saying, yeah, they were right about that. But that isn't to say that Vatican II then is a modernist council, because it still rejects all the dross. And there's a bit like, it's a bit like that, the wheat and the chaff, is that, you eventually get over time, and it takes the church a while, but, over time, the church is able to sort out the wheat from the chaff. So you are always going to find things in Congar and de Lubac and anyone of that generation who's worth talking about, including Garrigou-Lagrange and people, who
Yeah. With that,
who
I could
are
not agree more. I think that's fantastic.
certainly, far more nuanced than the kind of, the people who want to say that these are staunch anti-modernists see in them, but also far more of great value and tradition than the people who want to say that, no one says Garrigou-Lagrange, but certainly people like Rana, Ratzinger, Congar, well, early Ratzinger people do. But I always have a hermeneutic of continuity with Ratzinger, that I don't think that Ratzinger changes. I think the center ground changes.
Another point with which I am in deep agreement. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's not that something happens in the late 60s and Ratzinger suddenly goes conservative. It's that something happens in the late 60s and everything else suddenly goes to the left. That's not to say that his thought doesn't develop and, to live is to change, but there's a deep continuity. And even someone like, this is, my hill to die on is that Rana is a far more deeply traditional, classic dogmatic theologian than often his best supporters give him credit for.
Also far more scholastic than, say,
this is a guy who edited Denzinger, and if you read it, actually read him, he's quoting chapter and verse of Denzinger in a way that, theologians now don't.
I think though the criticism of Rana though is that his transcendental analysis leads to a theology of nature and grace that has some hidden time bombs in it that later come out.
Maybe.
And that Rana himself followed through on some of the late Rana. I don't know how much.
Yeah. No,
I don't know how much is true. I'm not a huge Rana fan or scholar.
I think my point is that the difficulty comes is that they then reject all Rana and anything Rana ever said.
Exactly.
Anonymous Christians is a case in point, which is always cited as proof of Rana's great heresy. And if you look in the 1960s, every major theologian, including Ratzinger, including von Balthasar, including de Lubac, is saying something more or less exact.
This is Balthasar's polemical book in 1968 or no, Cordula Ernst. He has that highly polemical criticism of Rana at the very end, where he's criticizing the notion of anonymous Christianity. And yet Balthasar himself plays in that sandbox frequently.
Balthasar himself in Cordula says, of course, I'm not denying the fact that there are people who have an implicit.
And then later on in Was dürfen wir hoffen, dare we hope that all be saved? He's saying, well, we can hope everybody's saved, which implies that there's an anonymous movement of grace in everyone, everywhere, that we can hope is operative in some sort of sanctifying way.
Exactly.
So you're right. We have to put these.
And Ratzinger all think that non-Christians can be saved through Christ. They just don't think you can call them Christians because baptism is a public thing, as it were. That's
exactly.
The thing, but it's not to say. So
So the point being, that even someone like Rana needs to be taken seriously in his context, and not just to be summarily dismissed, which is what so many modern people do. Shaun, do you have anything?
I was laughing also because this whole idea of did the individual change or did everyone else, or and I'm 36 and I'll be like called out by friends about like a seeming inconsistency, and I'll be like,
well, you can imagine,
I never changed.
So I'm aware of my radical conversions on major points.
I can imagine what Ratzinger felt like in his 80s, where people have 5 decades of public utterances to evaluate by someone of that stature. But anyway, I have, if you want, 4 more paradigms from me.
Sure.
On modernism. So and I'll be very brief, but I gave this essay at the Newman Institute conference, the one that Podier spoke at. Also Chuck Taylor, Father Charles Taylor. Excellent modernism scholar. And then Klaus Schatz from
do not know him.
The University of Mainz, who's excellent. Excuse me, Klaus Arnold. I just said the author of the Vatican II book, but Klaus Arnold is a great scholar who has cited you, Stephen, and did
All
work.
the great scholars do, Shaun.
Yeah.
That's how you know. That's like the
He
secret
did
sauce
some.
in great scholarship.
That's
He
the
did.
tell.
Was it contra Bullivant?
Yeah. He said contra Bullivant's absurd smear campaign against Cyril. No, I'm just kidding. No, but he recently went into the CDF archives, or the artist formerly known as the CDF, and was looking precisely at this question of when the committee, for lack of a better word, I can't remember the term, was debating how Pascendi would work and how how they would condemn modernism when they evoke Newman, who does it and why. And it's really,
I didn't know. I'd love to see that. I didn't know that.
I mean, he cited you because he said, this is something that people are talking about, and they know the context of the debate in England, but what about the debate behind closed doors in Rome? And that was an anxiety was, and I believe Pius X himself said, I don't want this to be a condemnation of Newman.
Yeah.
I have to go back into Klaus Arnold. But anyway, Klaus Arnold is publishing this work in our journal, the Newman Studies Journal. It's excellent. Anyway, my 4 paradigms on modernism, the reception of modernism, very much map onto these 4 paradigms that Stephen and I have in the book. But the first paradigm is modernists are among us. So this is the kind of traditionalist paradigm. So, a lot of the confusion in the church is just modernism. So you'd get this from
infiltration.
Right, exactly. So you'd get it, of course, from SSPX. You'd get it from someone like Burke, would just very bluntly call out an opposing idea as modernist. And really a lot of popular Catholic apologetics, even by people who aren't affiliated with traditionalist groups. And I think one reason for that, so someone like Bishop Barron, who's really a sort of racehorsement conservative. He's
very much so, yeah.
A pro-Vatican II, post-conciliar, von Balthasar, but conservative, certainly. A lot of these people on the internet,
that's not what the trads say. I've read a lot of things on Twitter about that,
A lot of these folks, and I don't mean the well-informed trads that would have a whole set of reasons for why they don't like them. I mean, you're just run-of-the-mill American Catholic who sees on YouTube, can you believe shock horror, the Word on Fire guy, he thinks it's possible that all people will be saved. Well, the problem is they don't, and Larry knows this better than me, but they don't have the context of where is the Catholic theological conversation at.
Right.
So they think, oh, well, a good conservative Catholic like Benedict XVI would never in a million years entertain such a crazy, that's what the crazy liberal priest says at the Mass that I don't
and
like.
Yet Benedict does in Spe Salvi.
Exactly. So the whole problem, and this is a problem I think is brought to the surface by modern technology, because in the past, people may have had all kinds of misconceptions about what the church teaches or doesn't teach, or they certainly wouldn't have known what are theologians in Salamanca arguing about. Are they arguing about, implicit faith of an Aztec who rejects, the idolatrous religion or whatever? I mean, normal people probably didn't know anything about that. But now all you have to do is log on to the internet, and an algorithm puts, Taylor Marshall or Church Militant or whatever onto your screen, and all of a sudden, you're denouncing Bishop Barron as a heretic when you don't know the context. But anyway, paradigm 2, modernism was defeated. Paradigm 3, modernism was a scapegoat. So moving into a kind of, this was a basically good impulse that was then scapegoated. And then paradigm 4, the modernists were prophets. Okay, so someone would map onto something like maybe Hans Kung or something like that. So the church was persecuting the kind of righteous prophet. Now, the academy, of course, Catholic theologians, you would get a lot of paradigm 3 and 4 of the way that people would look back at modernism. But those are the 4, in my opinion. This is undeveloped, and I'm going to work more with it. But those are the 4 basic ways that at Vatican II and after Catholics.
That's interesting. I mean, I would place myself in my reaction to what I view as modernism in your paradigm number 4. The modernists were prophets, so long as I could add the qualifier, they were flawed prophets.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. The modernists were
just like the Vatican II paradigms. There's a lot of
overflow. Because going back to what Stephen said before, I mean, the modernists got a lot of things right. Okay, and that's what accounts for their sort of perduring Perduring value. Did Stephen freeze on it? No, you're there. You're
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
That's what accounts for for the perduring weight in gravitas of the ideas that they express. So anyway, I like your four paradigms. What say ye, Stephen?
But yeah, this was one of the Shaun chapters, so I just let him do his own. It was it was nice for him not to be talking about Jansenism for a change in that chapter. I thought so.
Give me another ism. Give me another ism. Larry,
what we need to do is a historical critical analysis of your new book to sort of delim who wrote what, because I have co-written things with people before, and you can sort of, like with Rodney Hauser, and so you can sort of say, okay, that's a Hauserism, that's a Chappism, so you can do a whole JEDP sort of
Well, I would say, like, all right, this chapter needs to be Bullivantized in a certain way, because Stephen is endlessly, I mean, he's absolutely filled to the brim with anecdotes. He just always has some sort of like about the liturgical reform. He'll have like some wild anecdote, like Catholics in different parts of India rioted over what was the vernacular, which is the most, normally when you talk about the vernacular in Vatican II, you say, okay, it went really well in most places, but there were these like weird experiments in other places. And then
I just wrote down Bullivantized, because that's going to become a standard term in my blogging,
Yeah. You're muted, Stephen.
Yeah, I think are you muted, Stephen? Or did we just lose your sound? Uh-oh. See, this was my fear. I warned these guys beforehand. I don't know. It's not muted on my end. Let me mute and unmute. Oh, he's going to come back in, I think.
Oh, okay.
He got it. So in the meantime, let's carry on this conversation about the four responses to modernism are very reflective of also those four responses to Vatican II. We've been on now for almost like an hour and 15, but I want to.
I didn't realize time flies with you, Larry.
Well, it's because I talk so much, but I do want to get down to a question, and hopefully when Stephen comes back, he can contribute to. Oh, there he is. I think he's coming back. And here we go. No, he's still muted. Yeah, you can swear. You can swear. You can swear all you want. Okay. On my end, it says you're still.
Can you hear me? Like if I talk?
Oh, yes, we can hear you now.
Is it sufficient quality?
Oh, it's better than before, actually.
Oh, there we go. Perfect.
No, there. Only your picture to me now. Your picture is at the bottom of my screen, and Steve and Shaun is shifted to the top. But anyway, before I want to get down, because I'm sure a lot of the listeners are saying, okay, this book's about Vatican II, and you guys are talking about 19th century, blah, 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 and modernism and paradigms and blah, brass tacks here. I'm going to ask two questions. The first one would be, why should we care about Vatican II anymore? What was, in fact, what did the council actually contribute theologically and pastorally otherwise, and why should it still be an ongoing concern? And then the second question is going to be, after we answer that, in the development of its ideas, the council obviously engaged in certain discontinuities with the past. And I want to talk about those discontinuities and what they portend with regard to our concept of authority, of infallibility, and those kinds of things. But so let's go to the first question. What is of enduring significance in this council?
Well, I mean, it's quite early to see what endures, but certainly if anything is, why is the council relevant to us today, given that we're, 60 years later?
60 years, 60 years.
Well, that's nothing, is it? 60 years later is nothing. 60 years after Nicaea, there was still
oh, yeah.
Exiling each other and whatever, 60 years after Trent, there were still some Protestants around, 60 years is nothing, right?
Well, one could say too that the fallout of Nicaea, requiring several more councils, lasted 300, 400, 500 years.
Well, this is one of the things we talk about in the book, is that councils very rarely succeed on the terms they set out for themselves. It's not to say they don't succeed, but Nicaea certainly doesn't solve the Arian controversy. Trent you look at what Trent was like set out to do.
Yeah.
It didn't stop Protestantism, did it?
No, it did not. No.
Obviously, Council of Florence didn't, solve the East-West schism, and Vatican II so far hasn't addressed all the problems that modernity and secularity and de-Christianization have thrown up.
Yeah.
So, there's a sense in which the problems that gave rise to the council, at least some of them, haven't gone away.
Right.
And also, we're still arguing about, we're still talking about, all the, paradigms that we've talked about, these are not just scholarly paradigms, these are in a sense things that, are playing out on Twitter or playing out in, grad seminars, in playing out in, in congregations, and that, so the reception of the council is still very much with us.
I agree.
And also, the council does change a vast amount of stuff. So you can't hope to understand the present pastorally, liturgically, the nature of religious life, the way in which popes and bishops interact, the nature of the curia. None of this really, everything is touched by Vatican, ecumenical relations, interfaith relations. Vatican II is a major part of the very recent backstory of all of it.
Yeah, I mean, as you note in the book, Pope John specifically mentioned ecumenism as one of the most important reasons for calling the council in the first place.
It's striking that, if you look at the headlines announcing, the new front page of the New York Times, ecumenism is front and center in all of the
and in that sense, and we'll get to Shaun in a second. We'll get to Shaun in a second. I often say that in some ways the council, the perception of the council, has been a victim of its own success, in the sense that it did greatly change the tone within the Catholic Church towards Protestantism, towards Judaism, towards other religions, in ways that we now just sort of take for granted. I've had rad trads criticize the council to my face or via Facebook and say, "Oh, blah blah blah," went too far and this, that, and the other thing. But then I would say to them, if you had a Jewish neighbor, what would would you shun them now, or would you support persecutions against them, as you might have seen in rural Poland in 1930s or whatever? The council has fundamentally altered the way Catholics approach such things. In that sense, it was a success. And we just sort of take that for granted. Or the fact that there are all these lay dudes like Taylor Marshall, and Peter Kwasniewski, and guys like this running around spouting their radtradness, are totally oblivious to the fact that the only reason why they're capable of doing that is because they have degrees as laymen that they would not have gotten in the preconciliar church by any stretch of the imagination. So they're a product of the success of Vatican II's sort of universal call to holiness. So I agree with everything that you've said about reception. But Shaun, you want to say something? Obviously,
I think the same thing about when I hear dubious homilies from permanent deacons. This doesn't exist without Vatican II, of course.
That's right.
Although thankfully the ones in my area are wonderful. But
no, mine actually.
I've heard some really good homilies from permanent deacons.
Actually, some of the best homilies I've heard of late. But it is one of the things that Vatican II brought back. So there's a lot of branches that people are sitting on that get sawed off if you come too hard at Vatican II, which is quite interesting. So as far as the successes, I mean, well, as Stephen says, you can't understand contemporary Catholicism without understanding Vatican II, whether you're talking about Nigeria, the Philippines, the Netherlands, Poland, you can't understand it. You also, I would say the successes of the council in a purely kind of literal sense, so without a sort of theological judgment, but just in the sense, what did the council do that has taken root in some way? There are certain things that the council did so successfully that it's difficult to even explain to Catholics the preconciliar status quo. So someone can be a devout mass-going Catholic or even a daily mass-going Catholic and cannot fathom the notion of whatever the antithesis of religious liberty is. So, because you got to be careful how exactly you phrase this, but religious coercion, or a confessional state in which, you know, the other religions are legally penalized or suppressed or what have you. They can't fathom how that could be a Catholic position. The whole lex orandi, lex credendi, which is often, you know, weaponized, but the way that we now talk about Protestants and Jews, and I say that from my context, obviously Protestants are much more significant here than the Orthodox, but I'm sure it's the Orthodox in other parts of the world. The way that we talk about non-Christians, non-Catholics, the Stephen, as a layman with you know, very traditional sympathies, writes a book on the salvation of atheists, you know, with the degree that he gets as a lay theologian from Oxford. I mean, this is the fruit of Vatican II, whether you think it's wonderful or whether you think it's
the rotten fruit of Vatican II.
It is the fruit of Vatican II. And that's a fact. So the traditionalism that you're often in conversation with, Larry, is post-Vatican II traditionalism and can never be anything but that. And that's just, and that's what happens with these epoch-changing events like the French Revolution. To be a conservative after the French Revolution is to be a new thing. It's not to be the same thing as to be a conservative in 17.
I would argue too that a lot of traditionalists that we see now in the resurgence is the result of two things. Number one, liturgical reform. I would be of the opinion that one of the negative fruits of Vatican II was the botched, what I consider to be a botched liturgical reform. Now, I think the liturgy needed to be reformed. I think Sacrosanctum Concilium is a wonderful document. I attend an Anglican ordinariate church, and I wish all liturgies across the world looked like the Anglican ordinariate liturgy. I think it's what the Council Fathers may have had in mind, more vernacular and all that, but still extremely traditional. So I think if we'd sort of maintain some semblance of high liturgy in a high register with a deep continuity with the old mass, I think that would have sort of defanged some of the traditionalist response. But also, I think a lot of modern rad trads are simply red pilled by Pope Francis. Let's just put it that way. These are formerly JP2 conservative Catholics of that sort who have now, for whatever reason, for right or wrong, and I don't want to get into that, have become convinced that Pope Francis is sort of an arch heretic and all these sorts of things. And so their attitude now is, well, if that's the fruit of Vatican II, then to hell with it. I'm going back to the Latin Mass and the syllabus of errors, and that's that. So that's my sort of historical take on what's going on over the past 10 years. Especially.
Can I add an issue that Stephen and I talk about in the book, which was originally pithily phrased by John Courtney Murray. The issue under the issue was change. And then John O'Malley picks this up, and then, you know, so that what happened, in my opinion, during the pontificate of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, especially with Benedict XVI, or we should say Joseph Ratzinger, because it's a 1985 interview, the hermeneutic of continuity. So there's this kind of settling down of potential quote unquote conservative discontent with Vatican II because you have the hermeneutic of continuity. Now, the people who advocate that, usually there were certain discontinuities like religious liberty that they just didn't worry about because they agreed with them, or they didn't realize that it was a change, or whatever it might be. What has happened with Francis, I think, is Francis is he's not committed to the same sort of paradigms that Benedict was, even though the way Benedict, as I argue in the book and elsewhere, Benedict's view of continuity was not static. It was this sort of dynamic racehorsement.
It was the hermeneutic of reform that he specifically says in that famous Christmas address to the Curate.
Exactly. And so for him, I think he's sort of clarifying himself, because in 1985 he says continuity and he says discontinuity. Now, he is a very sophisticated theologian, former Vatican II Peritus. He understands what he means. He understands what the Lubach means. But I think the way that was filtered down in popular catechesis and conservative American bishops and whoever else was using it was a far more static understanding than Ratzinger had. So I think when Ratzinger becomes Pope, he clarifies it. He says hermeneutical reform, which is continuity and discontinuity on different levels. What happened with Francis, I think, is that Francis is not as concerned about the sort of niceties of that. And one reason, he's a very different person, obviously, very different theological perspective.
By the way, I don't mean to interrupt, but Pope Francis, I don't know if you guys heard, has been taken to the hospital.
Yeah,
So I would ask all of my viewers, and everyone knows I'm not a big Pope Francis fan, but he is our Holy Father. He is a human being, and I ask everybody to please pray for him. And I ask that most sincerely. But anyway, go ahead, Shaun.
Well, Francis is also when Stephen and I make this point in the book, he's the first actually truly post-conciliar pope. So he's the first pope to not have attended or participated in the council in any way. And he was in fact ordained priest after the conclusion of the council. So his whole priestly ministry is post-Vatican II. He doesn't, the same sorts of debates, Benedict is in the 05 address has an eye on the SSPX, I believe. This is a kind of saying, if you come in, it's under these conditions. So we're offering you this sort of olive branch. He lifts the excommunications shortly after this, but it does come with conditions. You have to accept the council in the way essentially that he lays out. Okay. Francis is just not playing the same game, not interested in the same set of problems. For him, it's an event from the past that has given shape to his entire priestly ministry. It isn't a sort of live battle or a live discussion. That's my
okay. Well, this is good, and I'll get to Stephen in a second because I was just sparring with somebody online about this. This is the first time, Shaun, that I might slightly disagree with you.
I thought if you were honest that you would.
Yeah, slightly disagree with you. I mean,
but
after
for
all,
such a cantankerous old man, you like agreeing with people, actually.
That's right.
You actually enjoy agreeing with people.
I'm just a cranky old anti-papal crank or something. I was called an anti-papal crank or something or other, because I responded to an essay that was essentially saying what you just said, that he's the first truly post-conciliar pope, and John Paul and Benedict were ordained before the council, and therefore were still formed in their own minds in a Tridentine mindset.
But let me clarify, that's not as important to me as what's important is they live through the council and they fight the battles of the council in the terms. Right. That's right. What I think is.
Well, that I agree with. But the impetus of this comment was essentially that Francis represents a sort of a fresh, new sort of way of approaching that in some sense, Francis understands the council better than John Paul and Benedict did, precisely because he became a priest after the council. And because he wasn't involved in the conciliar process and he wasn't trained before the council, his is a fresh point of view and a fresh mind. And for him, the council is just a historical fait accompli, not to be debated, and so on. And yet, Francis how old was Benedict when he died? 96. Okay, so Francis is only 10 years younger than Benedict. All right, he was born in the 30s. All of his youthful formative years took place in the pre-conciliar church in Argentina, for crying out loud. And the fact is, he was trained basically during the council, and of course, change was in the air and all that. But I would argue not so much that he represents the sort of first truly post-conciliar pope. I think Pope Francis is simply representative of a different school of thought. I agree with that. I think he's more prone towards the so-called Bologna school, whether or not the Bologna school is real or not, but the school of thought that sees Vatican. I think, in other words, in your paradigm, he's in the spirit event camp.
Yeah. And
therefore is much more prone towards the idea, hey, it's okay if there's all these ruptures. That's okay, because the Holy Spirit can do a new thing. And I don't know. In some ways, too, and I'm going to say this, and then I'll shut up and let you guys talk, especially Stephen. I think in some ways, Pope Francis is more traditional than John Paul and Benedict. I think he flows out of a Jesuit tradition that goes back to the 17th century. He himself opposes casuistry, but I think his mind works in these categories of law versus mercy. That the whole Jesuitical tradition of casuistical thinking was, the Jesuits, okay, there's this moral law, and then now we have to come up with these casuistical ways of sort of working around that sort of conscience. I had this conversation with Matthew Levering on his book on conscience, where he points out that that after the 17th century, you see this rise, especially in Jesuit thinking, of the tremendous importance of conscience. and as a sort of hedge against the overweening of law. I think in some ways that's the sandbox that Francis plays in mentally, but I could be completely wrong about that. So I'm not a Francis scholar or a Francis.
Let me just follow up really quick and then go to Stephen. The fact that he simply has a different perspective, I think, is true. And I think it's actually healthy for Catholics to break out of a kind of papolatry. Popes can disagree with each other, and popes have always disagreed with each other. And good Catholics can. I mean, I remember when I taught at a Catholic high school, I had an argument with a colleague, good-natured but tense. And this man's perspective was two good Catholics, if they're both catechized correctly, cannot disagree about a theology.
Oh, man. And that's what I'm trying to get.
Augustine and Jerome, like,
of course,
yeah.
This is a fruit of a kind of, I'm not blaming John Paul II at all, but it's this kind of very flowery, nostalgic, weird post-conciliar Catholicism where there's this sort of celebrity worship of John Paul II. And, the catechism clarifies everything, and there's no sort of historical consciousness of any kind. That kind of stuff is not sustainable, and it had to be exploded. Maybe Francis has exploded it in ways that are imprudent or unhelpful or wrong, but he has exploded it. And I think
agree with that.
That's actually kind of, what did he say? Make a mess. The question is, can the pieces be put back together in a healthier way?
Well, that's interesting because right after he told the youth there in South America, make a mess, he said, but be sure you clean up your mess afterwards.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's helpful.
Yeah, but be sure you, in solidarity, he said, you be sure you're there to clean up the mess too. And I don't think Jean Paul bought into the whole papolatry thing or the
no,
sort of,
but
he inadvertently fed it. He used the papacy as a bully pulpit to help bring down. He was geopolitical. But anyway, Stephen, go ahead. I don't want to get way off on that tangent.
Well, I think I've got just two. I'm just enjoying listening to you both. I think there's just a couple of things I'd want to add. First of all, this kind of and you mentioned this before, Larry, but it's one of the things of this kind of 24-hour news cycle, and every time a pope says anything, suddenly it's like news.
Yeah.
And then suddenly everyone's saying, oh, you can't put any sort of authority if it's not in a properly kind of dogmatic document, then it doesn't mean anything. So if the Pope says something on an aeroplane, doesn't mean anything. It means, what are the levels of dogmatic weight? And actually, well, that's good dogmatic theology, right?
Yeah.
The trouble is that we haven't had that discipline for so long. So like you'll get very important principles cited. I mean, Shaun mentioned it earlier. Like Pius the 12th gave a address to some midwives, and then that enters the kind of the sort of the mental Denzinger.
Absolutely.
So we've had this kind of things that popes have said in absolutely not dogmatic contexts being cited as though they were quasi infallible pronouncements. Okay.
I know.
And then suddenly the people who've been doing that, and it's we've been in this sort of been easy to get into, at least for people of a certain mold theologically. Then suddenly it's like, oh, you can't do that. That's actually, why would you do that? That's papolatry. So I think that probably there is a necessary correction here from. But I mean, it's interesting how I'm sure that if when obviously in the distant future different papal styles, different papal types come in, then we'll all just switch roles again.
I think Pope Francis has exploded that papolatry.
Yeah,
and I agree with both of you then that this is a good thing.
So the other thing is I didn't mention it in the book because it's quite a difficult topic to talk about, but there's this whole thing. I do talk about this very important and very tricky statement on the Jews that the council makes that isn't in there in the original plan. It's clearly added in because John the 23rd wants it added in, but for all sorts of not just geopolitical reasons, but kind of ecclesial political reasons, there's a whole question as to whether the council will say anything, because it's read by Arab nations as being a kind of a political statement in favor of Israel.
Right.
And the Eastern Catholic churches, including people like Maximus Sai, who's always cited as the great liberal progressive, is very keen that the council doesn't make statements like this, partly because they have to live in these countries, right?
Hey, this is an example of being Bullivantized. I love this. This is great.
And are aware of the political consequences of any statement. But obviously, once the council has floated that it might make a statement, it can't then not make a statement. So you get this whole thing around a bomb gets planted in the Vatican around all this. And so there's. But the reason I mentioned this is because one of the things is this kind of issue around supersessionism, whether, Christ, kind of completely, the old covenant is kind of obsolete because of the new covenant. Now, it always strikes me in conciliar hermeneutics is that the two extremes, if you like, are both conciliar supersessionists. I mean, either, it seems ridiculous to me that, we'll sort of say, how wonderful it is that we've got rid of kind of theological supersessionism with regard to the promises made to the Jews, which is, of course, how Lumen Gentium 16 phrases this, those promises are never revoked. To then say that, Vatican II suddenly, supersedes all previous councils. But equally, it makes no sense whatsoever to cite chapter and verse from every other council and then to say, oh no, Vatican II, that one was a miss. And this is precisely the point that Benedict makes, that you can't, that this very same authority that either gives Vatican II its foundation also applies to the others. And likewise, the very same foundation that applies to Trent or Nicaea or Vatican I must also apply to Vatican II. So you have to have some kind of hermeneutic of reform. Every council, you don't call a council unless you want to change something. I mean,
that's absolutely true.
At some level of doctrinal formulation or practice or something, councils are, this is something else we talk about in the book. A council is a massive logistical ball ache. It's not a phrase I use in the book. But you don't call them lightly.
The editors cut that kind of stuff out.
Which means that you only ever call them when it's too late.
Oh gosh, isn't that true? Is the church is, by the way, the church is already, always 100 years behind.
I mean, Trent is a classic example. You get around to calling a council when the problem is already out of hand, and so the council you call to solve that problem cannot possibly solve the problem. It may do other very critical things that need correcting, but they certainly those great councils never set out and achieve what they said they were going to do. And this is certainly true of Nicaea. This is certainly true of Trent. It's true of Chalcedon. I mean, we have these schisms that last to this day after Chalcedon and Ephesus.
Still
and Vatican II is the same. I mean, I talk about this in a previous book, Mass Exodus, certainly in terms of what the council sets out to do pastorally in Europe, which I think is a major reason why there's a council in the first place. It says we need a council to, solve this pastoral crisis. And it's by no means clear that the crisis is solved 60 years later.
I agree, and my critics, and I say this, whenever I'm critical of Pope Francis, the sort of where Peter is, critics come out of the woodwork to say, oh, you're violating Catholic doctrine, you're being disrespectful to the Pope and all these sorts of things. But in reality, I agree with both you and what Shaun was saying earlier, is that I think it's perfectly legitimate for popes to disagree with one another. And I think we have to explode this myth that every word that comes out of a pope's mouth is somehow of high magisterial weight, and therefore, if you criticize it, you're somehow undermining the church's ecclesial authority. The fact of the matter is, I don't criticize Pope Francis because I think he's a heretic, as the trads say, or I think he's a horrible person, as others say. Blah, blah. I just think he's wrong about a lot of stuff. Okay, theologically, I think he's just wrong, and so I say so. But that doesn't mean I think he's some sort of gross anti-pope or a horrible pope or these sorts of. I just think, okay, I preferred the exegesis of JP2 and Benedict and their take on things to that of Francis. And so I say that. And so then they get criticized. Okay, whatever. But I like what you just said, though, Stephen, about what the council, was up to and what it was doing. And that in the same way, and we can address this then, in the same way that in some ways we are now exploding the myth of the modern papacy and papalatry and ultramontanism and these things. It's also true that we can have an exaggerated sense, an overly romantic sense of a council, right? That councils too have to be, in a sense, demythologized. And this is in no way denying that there is authority in the church. At least I don't think so. So this maybe, as we wrap this up a bit, what do all of these sorts of exploded myths now, broken myths, as Paul Tillich would call them, about the aura of papal authority, or the aura surrounding councils, and the myth of constant material continuity in all things? When all of that is exploded, and as Shaun said earlier, it just can't bear the weight any longer of reality. What then is left of authority in the Catholic Church? Because I think that's the elephant in the living room that a lot of critics of the council and the modern popes, Francis in particular, I think this is what's lurking in the back of their heads. How do I reconcile that with why am I not then a Protestant? What's different between us and, say, the Anglicans then? What is Catholic authority? What is the authority of a council, and so on? Now, that's not what you're.
Dave Urban, Larry, because it's all there. I mean, this is, as far as I'm concerned, Dave Urban sets out precise. This is where, I converted to Catholicism while doing my doctorate on Vatican II.
And this is exactly what I was heading for. I'm glad you brought up, because my friend Father Robert Imbelli believes Dei Verbum is the key to the entire council.
Well, I believe Intermarifica is, and Shaun and I have bantered about this.
Well, you brought up Dei Verbum. So I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the interviewer and say, you must now talk.
Bullivant, the Bullivantizer, and make it Intermarifica, which is like universally panned as a kind of lame duck document. That's just to shock readers of the volume.
He zigs where others zag. It's that kind of thing.
It's a very like Oxford grad student thing to do. It's like, actually. It's like, out of nowhere.
Yeah, to try and find the most obscure bathroom in the palace and say that's my favorite.
Totally.
Actually, no. Dave Urban is short as well. Dave Urban, it's pretty concise. It's a really critical text, and that scripture tradition in the magisterium. Dave Urban 10 or whatever it lays out. I think that's where the authority is, and and actually that's almost. If you look back at, say, Nicaea, you look back at the Chalcedon, it's precisely this. It's that we have the scriptures, we have the tradition, and of course, Dave Urban doesn't really. In my view, it's not Dave Urban's view, is that the scriptures are themselves products of tradition and magisterium. Like, we and there's a sense in which scripture is the tradition points to scripture as a particularly important part of itself, essentially. So the magisterium is, again, with a nuanced understanding of levels of magisterial authority and all sorts of stuff. That's where
I would say that tradition / magisterium would say that scripture is the privileged loci within the tradition, a privileged loci.
I'll tell you something, though, and this is possibly a fruit of Vatican II. It's really, the last time we spoke was a book about non-verts, about de-Christianization in America and how that's played out in different denominations. And one of the things that's really struck me after that book, and it hadn't struck me before, is it's remarkable how unified the Catholic Church is, because we all, there's constantly driven by debates and arguments and that kind of stuff. But if you think, what do Robert Barron, James Martin, Taylor Marshall, and, I don't know, anyone else have in common? Well, it's probably about 95% of Catholic teaching. I mean, what we end up disagreeing hugely about is critically important, but it's a small proportion. And it's really striking that after if you look at kind of any other major denomination, any other mainline major denomination, the Episcopalians, the Methodists, they've all splintered over all sorts of doctrinal, moral issues, very acrimonious schisms. Apart from
in the United States, slavery was the big one.
Yeah, apart from very tiny schisms at both right and left, SSPX and kind of independent, women-led,
Catholics or something,
Catholic churches or whatever. It's really striking to me how the fact that the Catholic Church keeps the arguments in, and I often think about, you could say that, you could have a very harmonious Thanksgiving dinner with all the family there where everyone got along if you didn't invite all the people who you disagree with, right? If weird Uncle Fred wasn't was dead to you all and that kind of stuff.
That stupid libertarian aunt of mine is not welcome here.
Exactly. But if you invite, it's a far healthier family if everyone's there and you all disagree and bitch about each other. I think that's actually an important part. And that's actually one of the achievements. And it doesn't feel like an achievement, but it is an achievement.
But it's a real.
Well, it's also I have experience. I say that my daughter and I had this conversation one time about holidays and whatnot. Is it better to go to holiday with people who are good, kind, but boring, and agree on everything, or to go to a family that is utterly dysfunctional and querulous and but interesting and profoundly provocative? I would opt for door number 2, quite frankly. And I think that
you're the element that makes that, Larry. Like, you probably can't be in.
I am. I'm the irritated.
The apple that poisons the barrels, probably.
I'm the sand in the bathing suit of everybody's existence at those sorts of functions. We're kind of getting towards, but you did get towards something that I really wanted to get at, and I sort of alluded to it earlier. And I don't want to end without talking about this, which is, I asked before, what is the enduring legacy of the council? And maybe that was a wrong way to put the question in terms of what it is I'm really looking for. You've just alluded to Dei Verbum as an example of what I'm looking for, which is what primary theological developments did the council engage in that really are significant? I'll just throw one. Obviously, my blog is called Gaudium et Spes 22. And I was deeply influenced by de Lubac and his book, The Drama of Atheist Humanism. And I consider the Christocentric anthropology of the council, Christocentrism in general, as the central motif of the entire council. And quite to the surprise of many people when they find out that Christocentrism was new in many ways in the modern history of Catholicism, I would consider that to be one of the most, and John Paul, I think, agreed, which is why his first encyclical was Redemptor Hominis, which was a theological anthropology. So anyway, that's my take on the sort of leitmotif of the council that I think is very important. You've alluded to, Dave, but I'm going to ask each one of you guys to maybe riff on that idea as well. So let's start with Shaun, and then we'll go down to Stephen. Shaun.
Well, there's many developments that we've spoken about: religious liberty, relationships with the Jewish people, liturgy, of course, that sort of thing. But I think fundamentally, if I had to kind of synthesize all of that, I think the most profound thing is actually the way that the council was able to go backwards rather than forwards. And what I mean, you're alluding to this because it's a racehorsement motif that you bring up, which is that kind of anthropology is all over the fathers, the Greek
Oh
fathers,
yeah,
especially, right? And that's what these
yeah.
guys are reading. That's why they're so energized by this, and they think this can be this kind of evangelical explosion if we recover this. So I think what from the way that I look at it, based upon what I study and the way I've studied it, is the Catholic Church at Vatican II is able to reach back and recover all these positive sources, motifs, ways of thinking, ways of acting, a whole sort of ethos before or behind a kind of anti-Protestantism, anti-Jansenism, anti-modernism, all of which in their time were reacting to real problems, and to some extent
Yeah.
were successful or good, and to others extents were sinful or wrong-headed. But the church is able to sort of reach back and say, okay, what does the office of Pope and Bishop mean when we're not fighting the Reformation battles? Or what do we think about scripture reading and liturgy when we're not freaked out about Jansenist Italian synods, or whatever the issue might be? So it's able to sort of go back. I call them the ghosts on the council floor. It's able to deal with the presence of these ghosts in a way that is honest, or more honest, I should say, more honest and healthier than it was maybe in the 19th century or the early 20th century. I think that, ironically, fundamentally, it's the success is where Vatican II goes backwards rather than where it goes forwards. Although it does go forwards in the sense that it encounters, Christian democracy, liberalism. It does encounter the modern world in some ways in a positive way, but the enduring theological content is going back, way back, I think.
Well, that take gets 2 big thumbs up from me.
Good. Okay.
Yeah, I agree with.
I thought a von Balthasar fan would agree with that. So,
well, it kind of goes along with what I was saying too. But anyway, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have got any sort of grand, big idea beyond what Shaun has to say. And actually, one of the really nice things about writing this book was just how, we've been friends for a long time. We've talked about all sorts of stuff for a long time. It was just so nice to kind of co-author something where, obviously there's little points we disagree on, but it's actually, but we sort of probably, round each other out in that sense, I think. And it was just so nice.
We sort of swim in different sources too.
Yeah, so. Exactly. And so it was great. I think so. I agree with everything Shaun says. I do think that one of the big kind of leitmotifs of the council, Sacrosanctum Concilium, a point we make in the book is, it's the first document to be promulgated, and they use it to set out the store, right? So it's called Sacrosanctum Concilium. It's not called like something to do with the liturgy. It's called this sacred council, right?
Yeah.
And it sets out what's this council about, and it gives you kind of 4 reasons what the council's about. One's about ecumenism, and the rest are kind of what I would call new evangelization. And I do think that we don't have the phrase new evangelization, but the idea of the new evangelization is very much a motivating one at the council, as it had been. We talked about this about an hour ago, as it was for the generation of priests and bishops, particularly from Europe, because we do talk about the church, the council as this kind of world council and all that kind of stuff, but actually the kind of the agenda, the great kind of drafters of the council, are obviously coming out of a particular Western European context.
Oh, so true. And you mentioned at the end of the book, a Vatican III would look very different.
Yeah, and they're all deeply, all of those kind of great parity of the council are all deeply concerned about, this shift, which then John Paul II lays out in Redemptoris Missio. You've got kind of classic mission territories, which of course is a big part of what the rest of the church is dealing with at that time. You've got solidly established Christendom, where the church is ticking along nicely. And then you've got this intermediate situation where we're moving from solidly established Christendom back to kind of classic mission territories. And it's squarely in that new evangelization context that so much of the energy of the kind of the great, spearheaders of the council, very much including de Lubac, who you just mentioned. And that's where they're coming from.
I agree. I mean, the council has often said, oh, it's just a pastoral council. What that ignores, though, is that the pastoral aim of the council was grounded directly at theological development of doctrine as a response to modernity. And so there was development of doctrine, theological. So in many ways, my take on the council is this, is that its strength is also its weakness, which is that it is almost completely a council of theologians for theologians. It is a deeply theological council in a Euro academic register, and that a future council can take the fruit of all that theology and maybe do something with it, but it's going to do it in a far more global setting. Never again will any future major ecumenical council of the church be so Eurocentric ever again. Which kind of is exciting and scary at the same time. The next council could be a real Pandora's box.
It won't be boring. I would be
no, it will not be boring.
They never are.
They're never boring.
No, Vatican II is not boring. That's for sure. Absolutely. Hey guys, we should probably call this a wrap. We've been at it for a little about 2 hours now. But it seems like 15 minutes. I love talking to you guys.
You could listen to most of the audiobook in this time. So
oh, that's true. Yeah. So what are we actually saying? All right, if we get to the end of this video, we tell people you shouldn't have listened to this. You should have listened to the audiobook. I don't recommend audiobooks for anybody. A former student of mine asked me today, this book I recommended, is that in audio form? And I said, hence the problem.
Oh, no, I absolutely disagree. I love audiobooks.
Well, I don't have a commute, so I don't avail myself of them. But my friends who have commutes,
Oh, and look, I had people say to me, now my videos that I do are now in Podbean audio podcast. People wanted to listen to it in their car. So I get all that.
And then, if you go to a Benedictine monastery, over lunch, someone's reading a book to you.
They read the book to you.
That's it.
Don't you? I just, okay. I don't want to go down that
road.
I'm opposed to audiobooks, damn it. And that's the final word. But I do listen to them. So I'm a hypocrite, just like I'm a complete Luddite, but I do YouTube and stuff like that. So I want to thank both of my guests today.
The book.
Do you say like and subscribe?
Okay, so subscribe. Nothing I hate worse than a YouTube video where they begin. Be sure you click the subscribe button down below.
Smash that like button.
But hey, that's what Stephen does at the beginning of every. No, I'm just kidding. The audiobook is out, but the hard copy, if you're like Larry, comes out in the United States in May. So the UK
in May. Can you pre-order it?
Small.
Oh yes.
Small.
Okay. Very good. Get this book, but I'll go ahead and get the audio version now.
And I should say that this book, like you often like the books that we write are like expensive books.
Yeah.
This is like, single-digit dollars kind of book.
Oh yeah, my book on science and religion, which was put out by T&T Clark 20 years, it was like $800 million. So, I think 3 people bought it. There were some libraries devoted to the Jesuit religion that bought it. And then I think 2 guys in Singapore that hit the wrong button on Amazon bought it. And that was it.
That was it.
Yeah. Anyway, enough. Thanks everybody for listening. I know Vatican II will continue to be a hotly debated topic. Get this book. I think it will be very, very eye-opening. I also like George Weigel's recent book on Vatican II, which also acts as a kind of very short introduction. Not that I want to push your competition in the market here, guys. But I just want my viewers to know, I want them to read on Vatican II. I do. And I really think it's important. And your book, I think, is really fantastic. And I
thank you, Larry.
Thank you, guys. Okay, so we're gonna sign off now. Let's see where I am here. I'm going to stop.